That night, on the top floor of a five-star hotel in downtown Chicago, people were applauding to celebrate a future legal star. No one knew that the most underestimated man in the room was the only one capable of making all of them go bankrupt with a single signature. The French-style restaurant glowed under warm yellow lights. Crystal glasses, silver forks, immaculate white tablecloths, tailored suits, shimmering evening gowns. This was the world of lawyers, bankers, and financial consultants of the city, where every contract was worth an entire lifetime. Beside the graduation banner was the logo of Lakeshore Law School, a prestigious law school spoken of with the same reverence people used when mentioning the Harvard of the Lake Michigan shoreline. Mark Harris paused for a moment in front of the glass door and took a deep breath. The gray suit on his shoulders was slightly wrinkled at the seams, its old stitching bearing the marks of time. It was the suit he had bought at a discount store 3 years earlier, right before the wedding. His hands were raw and stinging after scrubbing them with industrial soap 3 times, yet dark grease stains still clung beneath his nails. The smell of metal, diesel, and a full day's sweat from the repair shop still lingered on his skin, even though he had changed clothes and sprayed cheap cologne. Mark pushed the door open and stepped inside. The soft jazz music seemed to slow in his perception, as if the entire room had turned to look at the stranger. A young waiter approached, glancing quickly at the slightly scuffed leather shoes and the unbranded jacket, then froze for half a second. In his eyes was a question Mark knew all too well. Had this man come to the wrong floor, or was he here to deliver food? "Sir, may I ask which table you are looking for?" The waiter's voice was polite, but the distance was unmistakable. "I am Olivia Harris's husband," Mark replied, his voice low as he tried to stay calm. The word husband sounded both familiar and foreign in his own mouth. The waiter's expression changed immediately. He bowed his head to check the guest list on the tablet, then looked up with the standard smile of luxury service. "Yes, miss. Harris's table is in the private room inside. Please follow me." He walked ahead, but his mind was still rearranging the pieces of information. A top-of-class law graduate, invited to cross an alder, mentored by a famous partner, yet her husband was a mechanic. A strange wife's story in this polished world. Mark followed, the soles of his shoes tapping against the marble floor. He glanced across the other tables, where people discussed million-dollar deals, tech startups, and stock markets. To them, revenge stories, marriage drama, and life stories about infidelity and divorce were nothing more than topics from reality shows on television. But he was living inside his own storytelling, with a silent narration and no witty host standing in the middle. Inside the private room, Olivia was sitting with her back toward the door, her brown hair curled softly, the black dress hugging her figure, her lips gently tinted red. She was smiling, the smile Mark had loved from the very first moment. But now he realized that smile was directed at the man beside her, not at him. Daniel Cross, 45 years old, tall, salt and pepper hair swept back, a perfectly tailored navy suit, a Swiss watch gleaming under his cuff. He had the face of someone accustomed to standing before cameras, the gaze of a man who knew exactly how much each consulting hour of his life was worth. To colleagues, Daniel was a dream mentor. To Olivia, he was the doorway into the world of the millionaire. When Mark appeared at the doorway, Olivia turned around. In that moment, time seemed to slow. There was a brief glimmer of recognition, something once deeply familiar in her eyes. Then, as if an invisible hand drew a curtain across it. Her smile faded slightly, then returned to a neutral, safe expression. "You're here," she said. She did not stand up, did not hug him like the days they once studied together at the small kitchen table in their old apartment. Mark felt his chest tighten. Those two simple words, "You're here," sounded more like a delivery confirmation than a greeting for a husband who had crossed half the city to attend the most important day of his wife's life. Daniel stood up and stepped forward, his hand extended at the correct angle, with the correct strength and timing. Daniel Cross, Olivia's mentor. His voice was deep and warm, every word precise. It was the voice people often heard in legal conferences where cameras were always pointed at him. Mark shook his hand and felt the smooth skin, the neatly trimmed nails, cold and dry. The hand of someone who writes, signs, negotiates. His own hand was calloused, with small cuts from metal edges and a long scar on the back from the day a gearbox slipped. Daniel withdrew slightly for a split second, and the professional smile immediately covered the reaction. In his mind, the picture was now complete. A brilliant woman escaping a life story of hardship, yet still tethered to a greasy past. Mark sat down in the chair opposite, suddenly aware of how broad his back felt in this space. He tried to make himself smaller, but the more he tried, the more out of place he felt. The waiter poured red wine into the glasses. Daniel began describing the grape variety, the region, the harvest year, the way to swirl the glass so the aroma could unfold. Mark heard the words as if they were a foreign language. Another image rose in his mind. The repair shop in North River, the old truck of a longtime customer, the burnt smell of oil leaking onto the exhaust pipe, Olivia laughing in the passenger seat while reading her law book, but still reaching to adjust the radio for him. Back then, he thought that as long as he worked hard enough, and the garage did not shut down, her path would remain smooth. That was how an ordinary husband understood happiness. He did not know that tonight, Olivia no longer saw that path the same way. In her mind, among the verdicts and historic legal cases professors spoke about, Mark's image had grown smaller. It appeared like the opening scene of a revenge story she no longer wanted to be a character in. She wanted her life to follow a cleaner, more elegant narration, one where grease-stained hands would never appear in the frame. Only one person in that room understood that the balance of power did not truly lean entirely towards Daniel. It was the unseen storyteller sitting somewhere outside the frame, staring straight at the scene. The mechanic being looked down upon, the mentor radiating prestige, the talented wife beginning to feel ashamed of her past. And the storyteller knew that with a single decision, a single phone call, that balance could be overturned completely. But none of the three in that room realized it. Not yet. The crystal glass fell to the floor and shattered into countless fragments in the middle of the banquet. That sharp, icy sound tore apart the elegant atmosphere, pulling every gaze toward Mark, the man everyone still believed was nothing more than a mechanic who had stepped into a world that did not belong to him. In that instant, Olivia froze. The hand lifting her wine glass halted mid-air. She did not understand what had just happened. Daniel narrowed his eyes, the corner of his lips curving into an unreadable expression. In the enclosed room, the scent of oak, red wine, and ambition blended together, creating a flavor only those accustomed to living in circles of power could recognize. But tonight, beneath the warm yellow lights, power was not resting entirely where everyone believed it was. The waiter hurried to crouch down, hands trembling as he picked up the shards of broken glass. Mark remained still. No panic, no embarrassment, no explanation. His eyes were deep and cold, as if he were the only one who could hear another sound hidden beneath the shattering glass. A sound that signaled something was about to change forever. Daniel broke the silence with a smooth, controlled tone. "It's all right, just a small accident." He turned to Olivia and placed a hand on her slender shoulder, as if reaffirming his position within the story. Olivia forced a faint smile, but inside her a storm was rising. She knew Mark was clumsy in settings like this, knew he did not belong to a world filled with invisible rules. But she did not know why, at that exact moment, she felt afraid of his calm gaze, afraid of his silence, afraid of the way he refused to explain or apologize like he always did. The dinner continued, but the rhythm had changed. Daniel took control of the conversation, speaking about an environmental lawsuit his firm had just handled. His voice was gentle and steady, yet every sentence cut like a thin blade. He described a small mechanical workshop being inspected, fined for violating waste regulations, dragged into debts. The owner, unable to endure it, ended his life alone in a cramped rented room. The table responded with polite, restrained smiles, all except Olivia. Her heart tightened. That image, that story, sounded like a cruel prophecy of Mark's future. The small garage on the outskirts, the old oiled drums, the rusted water tank, temporary permits, unstable income. She heard Daniel's voice, but inside her head was the sound of drills, metal grinding, and the cold wind blowing through a rusty rolling door. She saw the future she had long tried to avoid: failure, bankruptcy, and herself being dragged down with him. Mark sat quietly, not interrupting. He knew Daniel was talking about him without saying his name. He understood the rules of power in places like this. They did not attack directly. They used polite language, subtle hints, and coincidental examples to rearrange the position of every person at the table. They wanted to turn him into a symbol of the past, of the lower class, of life stories only worthy of being mentioned as tragic footnotes. But there was one thing they did not know. Mark was not just a mechanic struggling in grease and metal. In his jacket pocket, beside his old phone, was a thick file on a small industrial plot along a new freight route. He had been negotiating quietly for months with people Daniel had never paid attention to: contractors, engineers, railway operators. He did not boast. He did not reveal. He did not seek approval. But he knew that with a single announcement, the value of the land where the old garage stood could flip like a map being turned upside down. Daniel lifted his glass, swirling it gently as he continued his elegant monologue. "This world," he said, "is merciless to those who refuse to upgrade themselves." The sentence fell into the air like a verdict. Olivia lowered her head. Her heart felt as if it were being torn in two. One part still ached for every moment spent with Mark in the old kitchen, sharing cheap noodles and dreaming about the future. But the other part, the one already pulled too far toward the bright skyline, could no longer return. When the dinner ended, Daniel placed his hand on Olivia's back, as if closing an old chapter in her life. Mark watched that moment. A short moment. Still. But inside it was a storm. The glass door in the hallway slammed hard against the wall. Olivia startled. She had never seen Mark walk so fast, as if a storm had been compressed inside his chest and was about to burst out. The air in the hallway was icy cold. Neon lights stretched their shadows across the stone floor, thin and wavering. Mark leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, his hand clenched until his knuckles turned white. Olivia followed, the heels of her shoes striking the floor sharply, her heart caught between wanting to speak and fearing the very words she was about to say. "Mark, don't misunderstand what Daniel said in there." She tried to sound gentle, but her voice trembled, and Mark heard it clearly. He did not reply. He stared toward the window at the end of the corridor, where the lights of Chicago reflected on the glass like another city hanging in the sky. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow again. Olivia's heart pounded. That was no longer the gaze of a mechanic who had been hurt. It was the gaze of a man standing before a decision that could change the course of his entire life. She gathered all her courage. "Mark, I think we need to talk about the future, about the garage, about the risks. If one day—" She had not finished her sentence when the phone in Mark's jacket pocket vibrated, a dry, short, concise sound that echoed louder than the shattering crystal glass in the dining room earlier. Olivia froze. Mark looked at the screen, his face expressionless, but deep in his chest everything felt like it had caught fire. The call was from the Midwest Rail Infrastructure Development Board. The man's voice on the other end was deep, formal, without a hint of hesitation. Mr. Harris, I am calling to formally inform you that under the Northern Freight Expansion Resolution, the industrial land at Jefferson Yard, including the entire area of your repair shop, will be acquired by the state for the new intermodal hub project. The starting compensation amount is $200 million. $200 million. Olivia could not hear the content of the call, but she saw Mark's eyes tremble for a split second. A sharp, cold flash. Something invisible had just shifted. Then he closed his eyes slightly and took a deep breath. His voice was unnervingly calm. I understand. Please send me the official documents. I will sign when required. He hung up. There was no cheer of joy, no jump of happiness, no boastful word, only a heavy silence. A silence that made the long hallway feel as if it were shrinking. Olivia swallowed hard. Who was that? Mark turned back. His gaze softened for a brief moment, then immediately settled into a layer of composure as sharp as steel. A work call. She nodded, but her heart trembled. She had the feeling he was hiding something. Something far larger than the thin traces of oil trapped beneath his fingernails. Mark looked at her for a long time. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, not exactly sadness, more like the expression of someone who had just seen the true nature of a chessboard and finally accepted the move that his opponent believed had cornered him. Olivia, he said, his voice low and slow, each word heavy as lead, you once said we live in two different worlds. Maybe you were right. Her heart clenched. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a neatly folded set of documents, cold, sharp legal pages. This is the agreement on division of assets and liabilities related to the garage. You already had it prepared, didn't you? She was stunned. Daniel had sent her the draft beforehand. She had kept it like a life raft, just in case it was ever necessary. But now it was in Mark's hands. He knew. Since when? Olivia accepted the papers with trembling hands. In her head, waves were crashing onto the shore, loud and relentless. I only wanted to protect my future. Mark nodded slightly. No accusation, no anger, no bitter words. That was what truly frightened her. He signed. The stroke of his pen was decisive, clean, forceful, just 1 second. One signature turned an entire life upside down. He handed the stack of papers back to her. From now on, the garage is my responsibility. As for you, you are free. Olivia felt her legs lose all weight. Free. The word she had once longed for. Yet, why did it feel so heavy? In the distance, the city was still lit, the tall buildings gleaming like silent spectators. The storyteller knew that in that moment, it was not the one who left who was the winner. Power had just changed hands. But Olivia had no idea. And Mark, the man everyone saw as the loser, had just stepped into another world, one that no one in that elegant dining room could even imagine. The next morning, Olivia smiled brightly in front of the mirror, then burst into tears immediately. That smile was not because of happiness, but because of the hollow moment when she realized she had personally cut the last thread tying her to the past, and believed that it had been the right choice. Daniel's new penthouse was on a high floor, looking straight over the Chicago River. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains, spilling a pale golden shade across the cold stone floor. The scent of roasted coffee, expensive perfume, and new leather sofa blended together like a sweet confirmation that this was a different world, a world Olivia believed she deserved to belong to. She walked lightly through the living room, bare feet gliding over the thick, soft carpet. The luxury here was like a lullaby of temptation, making her forget the sound of engines from the old garage, forget the smell of metal, sweat, the smell of the life Mark had shared with her all those years. Daniel stood in the kitchen, white shirt on, sleeves neatly rolled up to his elbows. He always knew how to make every moment fall into place, even when it was just the gesture of pouring coffee. "Good morning," Daniel said confidently. Last night was difficult, but everything is now on the right track. You chose the right path." Olivia nodded slightly. Her heart did not fully agree, but her reason, sharp as the blade of a judge's gavel, forced her to believe it. She whispered to herself, freedom, cleanliness, future. 3 words that seemed radiant, yet inside felt as heavy as a stone hanging on her chest. Olivia saw in her mind scattered fragments of memory. The small kitchen with the smell of fried onions and Mark's hoarse laughter after a long workday, the freezing winter nights when they shared one old coat because the electric bill was too high, the days she wrote her papers and Mark made coffee with a cheap machine, placing it in front of her and only saying 3 words, "You got this." Those simple slices of life had not disappeared. They had just been pushed into a dark corner and covered by the luxury lights of this place. But the brighter the lights, the clearer the shadows. Olivia stood by the glass window looking down at the flow of cars below. Suddenly, fear crept into her heart like a draft seeping through a crack in the door. What if Mark failed? What if the garage collapsed exactly as Daniel predicted? What if the debts exploded like a time bomb? She would be dragged down with him. She had believed that. Believed it so much that she pushed herself into the most ruthless decision of her life. Daniel moved closer and placed his hand on her back. "Don't look down too long," he said in a gentle yet arrogant tone. "The people down there can only dream of standing here. And today, you are here." That sentence, to someone else, might have been encouragement. But to Olivia, it tasted like the sharp edge of a sweet knife, a blade cutting into an old belief. On the other side of the city, Mark was standing in the middle of the repair shop. No champagne, no morning coffee, only the smell of oil, the sound of machines, and the cold white light from industrial bulbs. Yet, in his eyes, once seen as tired and dulled by years of labor, another kind of light was burning, quiet, steady, deep as bedrock. He lifted the project file, his fingertip brushing lightly over the compensation seal. $200 million, a figure capable of wiping out every prejudice that had forced him to stand lower in other people's eyes for so many years. He did not tell anyone, did not talk, did not call. He simply stood there and breathed slowly. True strength does not shout. True strength stands still and waits for its moment. Olivia, at this time, still knew nothing. She believed she had left a burden. She thought she had escaped a poor, dreary life story to step into a clean, shining future. But the storyteller understood clearly the freedom she was clutching was nothing more than a rope that had been cut from the wrong end. Daniel's shadow stretched long across the floor, drawing Olivia's along with it. 2 shadows that seemed to be walking side by side were in fact moving in opposite directions, one toward false power, one toward real power. Quiet, enduring, more formidable than any light in this penthouse, and in the space between them, fate began weaving invisible threads, slow, silent, but unbreakable. It was only a matter of time before the first mask would fall. The news bulletin abruptly cut through the gentle music in the nail salon, and in just a brief moment, Olivia's world collapsed like a layer of polish that had not yet dried on her fingernails. The screen on the wall showed the image of a major city press conference, where the spokesperson announced the new intermodal hub project and clearly read the name of the landowner who would receive $200 million in compensation. $200 million. The phrase pierced straight into Olivia's chest like an icy blade. The glass of water slipped from her hand, shattering on the tiled floor into sharp little pieces like metal. The sound rang out in the silent room, drawing shocked stares from all around. But Olivia no longer heard anything. Her ears rang. Only the pounding of her heart remained, heavy, urgent, as if it would tear her chest apart. The name was repeated a second time on the screen. Mark Harris, owner of the repair shop lot at Jefferson Yard. The man she had left only a few days earlier. The man Daniel had called the shadow of failure. The man she believed was the final full stop to her future. Mark. Olivia's body went numb. Her eyes fixed on the bold letters, and in that short moment, the truth surged into her mind like a storm with no escape route. She had signed, with her own hand, decisive, cold. And she had believed she was escaping a ticking time bomb. But what she had thrown away was not a burden. It was gold. A massive gold mine whose lid had just been opened. People in the salon whispered and fussed around her. Staff hurried to hold her shoulders and asked if she was about to faint. Olivia did not answer. Her gaze remained glued to the screen. The words from the press conference kept pouring out, each one like a hammer striking stone. Economic turning point, key project, historic record-breaking compensation. She should have been there. She should have been walking beside him on that path. But now, in the middle of that cold room, she was just an outsider, watching Mark's life turn in a direction she no longer had the right to touch. A tear rolled down her cheek, then a second one followed. Not because of the money, not because of $200 million, but because of something far heavier, the truth that she had misjudged the man who had stood beside her through her hardest days. She had not left him because he was weak. She had left him because she did not have enough courage to stand and wait. On the other side of the city, Mark stood in front of the closed garage door. The sky was a solid gray, as if a layer of cold lead had been poured over the entire old industrial neighborhood. His phone lay silent in his pocket. He did not turn on the television, did not watch the press conference, did not call anyone. He just stood there, listening to the wind whistle through the rusty sign hanging on the workshop door, the chill seeping into his chest. No wild joy, no explosive celebration, only a deep stillness. The calm of someone who has lived through enough long nights to understand that true victory does not need to speak. He remembered the evenings spent at the scratched metal table, his grease-stained hands lifting a cheap cup of coffee. He remembered Olivia's eyes in those days when she still believed that if they worked hard enough, the two of them would make it through. He remembered the moment that gaze changed, silently, slowly, then drifted far away. He did not blame her. But the fracture was still there, sharp, cold, impossible to mend. In a glass-walled office downtown, Daniel stared at his laptop screen where an internal news bulletin had just been sent out. The lines of his face were tense. Sweat beaded at his temples, even though the air conditioning was set low. In his eyes appeared a feeling he rarely tasted. The panic of a man who had just realized he misjudged someone he had always thought was insignificant. He had not only pushed Olivia into a cold-blooded decision, he had personally cleared the path for an opponent he never imagined would exist. Mark was no longer the mechanic from the condescending stories. He had just stepped onto a different playing field, where the rules were no longer written by Daniel. On the sidewalk outside the salon, Olivia rushed out, ignoring the stares around her. The wind lashed her face, smearing mascara down her cheeks. Her breath came in ragged bursts. Her steps trembled. She did not know where she was running to. She only knew there was one burning question in her heart. Why was he silent? No calls, no explanations, no reproach. He just signed, just walked away. And now, when the curtain had been torn down, she finally realized that the man who had been looked down on the most was actually the one holding the real power. In that moment, in different corners of the city, 3 lives faced 3 choices. One person trembled because the truth had come too late. One person collapsed because he misjudged his opponent. And one person stood tall in the storm without needing to prove anything. Because there are powers that do not need spotlights. They only need the right moment to turn the entire game upside down. The garage door flew open and slammed against the metal wall. Olivia burst in as if someone had pushed her from behind, her breath broken, her eyes red. Mark stood in the middle of the workshop, still holding the heavy wrench in his hand, the cold white light of the industrial bulbs casting a calm, almost frightening stillness across his face. "You knew beforehand, didn't you?" Her voice exploded into the wide space, echoing hoarse. $200 million. You knew, and you deliberately hid it from me. Mark did not answer immediately. He placed the wrench down on the metal table, the sound of steel striking steel ringing out dry and cold. His gaze did not avoid hers. No fear, no defensiveness, only a stillness as deep as the surface of the water before a storm. Olivia stepped closer, her hands clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms until they hurt. "You tricked me into signing. You stayed silent so I would walk away on my own. You used me like a piece in your revenge." Mark's throat moved slightly. He spoke slowly, each word solid and heavy. "You did not sign because of me. You signed because you believed I would fail, because you chose to leave." Olivia froze. That sentence hit her like a splash of cold water to the face. Her breath caught in her chest. Mark continued. His voice was low, neither angry nor raised, yet it struck straight into the heart of the person standing before him. "You called this garage a risk. You were afraid it would drag you down, afraid of being poor, afraid of failing. So you left. Do not turn your own decision into my fault." Olivia shook her head, tears spilling over, not only from hurt but from the shame clawing at her from inside. "We have 3 years of marriage. You cannot just stand there and cut everything off like that." 3 years, Mark repeated, his voice dropping. 3 years did not turn me into a burden, but one word, fear, turned love into a transaction. She stepped back half a pace. Her eyes wavered. A very long silence passed. The wind whistled through the crack in the door. The air smelled of cold metal and burnt rubber. Olivia looked around, at the space that had once been theirs, now strange and distant like another world. We can start over," she said, her voice shaking as she tried to grasp what had already broken. "I was wrong. I just want to be with you." Mark looked at her for a long time. His eyes were no longer those of the man who had been left behind. They were the eyes of someone who had walked to the other side of pain. Deep, steady, clear. "You want to be with me," he said softly, "or you want to come back for $200 million. Olivia felt as if she'd been struck hard in the chest. She tried to open her mouth, but no words would come. Her lips trembled, then fell still. "I once begged you to stay," Mark said, his voice even, neither shaking nor rushed. "But that night, you chose. You left, long before this money appeared. Power does not lie in the number. It lies in where your heart chooses to stand." In that moment, for the first time, with a clarity that hurt, Olivia understood that the man who had once been underestimated, the man she thought belonged only to the dark corners of the workshop, was the one now standing higher. Not because of the money, but because he did not need to cling to anyone to survive. Tears fell, but there was no excuse strong enough to mend what had been done. Mark turned his back. He flipped the switch on the wall. Some of the lights went out. The rolling door began to lower, slowly, heavily. The space between them narrowed, like the last door of a chapter of life closing shut. "We ended that night," Mark said without turning around. "It is just that today you finally see it." The court summons was placed on the metal table in the workshop, just as the last rays of afternoon sun touched the edge of the door. The bold printed line was as cold as a blade. Request to annul divorce agreement, freeze assets, and investigate concealment of information. Olivia stood behind Daniel, her fingers interlocked so tightly they had turned white. Mark simply looked at the paper in silence, as if what had just fallen onto his life did not have enough weight to shake even a corner of his mind. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice sharp. We accuse you of deliberately concealing information related to the land acquisition project, causing my client to sign the agreement under unfavorable conditions. We will bring this matter to court." He enunciated each word clearly and confidently, just as he had in countless hearings before. With one difference this time, in front of him was not a disadvantaged client, but a man he had once looked down on so much he did not even bother to count him on the board. Olivia did not dare look at Mark. Inside her was a tangle of emotions, fear, regret, the tearing wish to turn back time. But Daniel was different. He refused to accept defeat. He refused to watch a mechanic step into a position he believed should belong only to those trained in glass towers. Mark lifted the stack of documents. His fingers slid lightly along the edge of the paper, his eyes deep and calm. He did not refute immediately. He simply asked one quiet question that struck straight into the place Daniel had not prepared to defend. "You are suing over a choice that you yourselves made." Daniel clenched his jaw. His breathing grew heavier. "You knew about the compensation before signing the agreement. And you," Mark turned to Olivia, his voice slow, "believed I would drag you down. You chose to walk out of my life, not because of the truth, but because of your own fear." She trembled slightly. Her eyes reddened. Daniel cut in, his tone sharp as a blade. "That is irrelevant. The core issue is the financial information that was not disclosed at the proper time." Mark's gaze changed. Not with anger, not with explosive defiance, but with the serenity of someone who knows he is standing on firmer ground than anyone else. "That information arrived in the final moment. And I signed in that same moment. You did not lose because I was silent." He paused, his voice dropping. "You lost because you misjudged the man you once called your husband." The sentence fell. Heavy, cold, true. A long silence settled over the workshop. The distant hum of an exhaust fan from the neighboring building echoed in, stretching the tension hanging between the three of them even tighter. Daniel let out a faint laugh, the kind of laugh belonging to someone accustomed to winning. "The court will decide, and before any judgment is made, we request a freeze on 5% of the compensation amount to secure our client's interests." Mark set the file down, but this time he did not remain silent. There was a resolve in his voice that Daniel had not anticipated. "You cannot freeze what is no longer personal assets." Daniel's gaze stalled. "What do you mean?" Mark looked straight at him. "The advance payment has been transferred into an infrastructure development investment trust, an independent entity, fully legal, not under any individual's name." He pronounced each word clearly, without boasting, simply stating the facts. Daniel's arm tightened at his side. Olivia's breathing grew shallow. In that moment, they realized that the man who once stood under the dim shop lights with oil-stained hands had stepped into another world long ago, a world where the rules of the game were no longer in their control. "You put all this in place before we even thought of doing this," Daniel said softly, his voice hoarse. Mark did not deny it. "I am not fighting anyone. I am only protecting what belongs to me and the years you chose to walk away from." Olivia bit her lip. Tears fell onto the back of her hand. She had once believed that power meant standing at the highest place with the lights shining down on you. But now, in front of her, power took on another form: silence, discipline, resilience, and freedom from dependence on anyone. Daniel gathered the documents back. For the first time, his eyes were heavy without their usual arrogance. "Fine. We will see each other in court." When they left, the wind slipped through the crack of the metal door, bringing with it a cutting chill. Mark remained in the empty workshop, his hand resting on the old steel table. No gloating, no joy. Only the sensation of closing a chapter of his life, and knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. The phone call came in the middle of the night like a hammer smashing into a wall of silence. Daniel jolted upright in his high-rise apartment, cold sweat running down his back as the banker on the other end informed him that his strategic loan had been fully transferred to a new creditor, with immediate repayment demanded. No extension, no negotiation, no escape. In the thick darkness, the city lights cast a gray hue over his face. Daniel understood at once what was happening. An invisible hand had moved far ahead of him, quietly, precisely, ruthlessly, and that hand belonged to Mark. The next morning, Daniel's law office was no longer the place he walked into with his usual confidence. The air was dense, staff whispering, their confused eyes avoiding his. On his desk lay stacks of bank documents, foreclosure notices, auction schedules for seized assets. Each sheet of paper was like a sharp blade driven into the pride of a man who had always believed he controlled every game. Daniel tried to keep his voice steady as he called financial partners one after another. But with every call, his face grew more drained. The people who once flocked around him, raising their glasses in celebration, now turned cold to the point of cruelty. No one wanted to be dragged in. No one wanted to extend a hand to a sinking ship. In another part of the city, Mark stepped out of the main conference room of his newly founded infrastructure investment company. Behind him, rows of screens displayed zoning maps, engineering markers, and capital flow indicators. Teams of experts quietly conferred, operating a system Daniel could never have imagined that the mechanic would be able to build. Mark did not smile. He did not revel in triumph. He understood that real strength did not lie in defeating others, but in guarding the future he had chosen, a future no longer tied to the gaze of anyone else. Meanwhile, Olivia sat alone on the cold stone steps outside a building, her hands clenched, her heart swaying between two fears, losing Daniel and losing herself. She had once chosen to leave Mark and chase the light Daniel promised. But when that light suddenly turned into a deep, black void, she realized she no longer had any place to stand. Daniel stepped out of the elevator, his gait heavy. He did not have to speak, yet Olivia already knew the outcome. His eyes were like shards of broken glass, sharp, exhausted, bitter. "They want everything," Daniel rasped. "The office, the assets, even the reputation I've built over more than 10 years. He tried to smile, but the smile died almost instantly. All of it. Because of one wrong move, Olivia gripped his hand tightly. In that moment, she was not just afraid of losing money and status. She was terrified of having to face the truth that all the clever calculations she had once been proud of had become the very knife turning back on her own life. Night fell. The city glittered, but to Daniel, everything had turned into a thick darkness. He stood by the window, looking down at the streets flowing with ribbons of moving light, his heart weighed down. He thought of the first time he met Mark at that elegant restaurant, of the contemptuous look he had given the man in the old suit with oil stains still faintly clinging to his hands. Now, that same face, that same calm gaze, stood far above him, and what cut deeper than anything was the fact that Mark had never needed to prove it with boasting words. A single thought flashed in Daniel's mind, persistent, like a nail driven into his temple. He had not failed simply because he lost money. He had failed because he had misjudged a man. At the same time, Mark stood on the project balcony, the wind blowing hard and carrying with it cement dust, the smell of hot steel, and the rhythmic pounding of machinery like the heartbeat of a city being rebuilt. Below, the engineers and workers toiled through the night. This was not just a project, it was the turning point of his entire life. In Mark's eyes, there was no longer the twisted weight of the past, no lingering shadows of hurt, only steadiness, determination, and a profound sense of freedom, the kind of freedom only found when a person has the courage to step out of the role others have forced onto him. From afar, the wind howled past the rows of steel frames. The night was long, but no longer cold. At opposite ends of the city, two men faced their defining moments. one learning for the first time what true collapse felt like. The other truly understanding the depth of quiet power, a power born from patience, self-respect, and the ability to stand firm even when being underestimated. And somewhere in the silent space between those two worlds, fate continued to turn its wheel, preparing for the next bend in the road, where truth would keep stripping away the masks layered over each polished face. The doorbell rang in urgent succession before dawn had fully broken, like the warning siren of an approaching storm. When Olivia opened the door, 2 enforcement officers stood blocking the entrance, their voices cold as they announced the order to seal the luxury apartment she had once proudly shown off to all her friends. The bright red seals stamped onto every door, every glass cabinet, every luxury item were not ink, but blades cutting away the glossy shell she had clung to all this time. The spacious room suddenly felt empty and heavy. Each footstep echoed like the sound of collapse. Olivia stood in the middle of the cold floor, a small suitcase abandoned beside her, her heart flooded with a panic she had never experienced before. No more party lights. No more expensive wine glasses. No more late evenings looking down at the city from above, believing she had crossed into another world. All of it was gone. Only an icy chill ran up her spine. Daniel sat in the corner, both hands covering his face. He had fought for days, begging, negotiating, signing one petition after another. But the game had slipped from his control from the very first moment. The foreclosure notices scattered across the table looked like the wreckage of a battlefield. The pride that had once defined him was now nothing but silent ruins. "We will be fine. We just need time," Daniel tried to say, but his voice shook and broke at the end. Olivia looked at him, and for the first time, she no longer saw a powerful, commanding man, but a desperate human being sinking into the fragments of his own making. She turned away, her heart clenched. The feeling of loss tightened around her like a vice. Suddenly, she thought of Mark. She remembered that freezing night at the old garage. Remembered his calm eyes as he watched her walk away. Back then, she believed he was the past, the burden, the anchor weighing down her life. But now, the one weighted down was not him, it was her. The wind slipped in through the window frame, carrying the sound of car horns from the street outside. The world kept turning, kept moving, regardless of whether one life had collapsed or not. Olivia felt like a tiny shard knocked off the orbit she had once thought she belonged to. She walked over to the window and looked down at the distant road below. The flow of cars moved like an indifferent current. Deep inside, a painful question rose up. What truly has value? Power, fame, or the kindness she had carelessly thrown away that night? The apartment gradually emptied as the officers finished their work. The belongings were sealed, light reflecting off the cold strips of tape. Nothing was left that belonged to them. No place left to hide. Olivia closed her eyes. The tears did not fall in torrents. They traced a single warm, thin, quiet line down her cheek. No more excuses, no more blame. Only the truth laid bare in the raw, exposed space. On the other side of the city, Mark stood in front of the scale model of the major infrastructure project. Blueprints spread out under the warm yellow lights. He felt no gloating, no joy over anyone's failure, but in his heart one thing had become clear. True strength was not meant for revenge. It was meant to walk away from the past without looking back. The sound of the gavel striking wood cracked through the air like thunder on a clear day. The courtroom fell silent. Every gaze turned toward the plaintiff's table, where Olivia trembled slightly, and Daniel sat motionless, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The judgment had just been read. The divorce agreement was fully valid. All requests to overturn it were denied. No way out. No way back. In that moment, the air seemed to thicken, then break apart into a heavy emptiness. Olivia could no longer clearly hear voices, chairs scraping, cameras clicking in rapid succession. Everything faded, leaving only the thudding of her heartbeat in her chest, heavy and slow, as if it were falling into a bottomless pit. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure, but his eyes reflected total collapse. From a proud attorney, he had suddenly become someone pushed to the edge of the game. No more reputation, no more power. And worse still, he realized that in the battle he thought he was orchestrating, all this time he had only been chasing the man he once looked down on. Mark rose from his seat, his steps steady, unhurried, without any display. Light from the high windows fell across his shoulders, casting his shadow long over the cold floor tiles. He did not look at Olivia, did not look at Daniel. Not out of contempt, but because there was nothing left that needed to be said. Olivia stood up abruptly, as if an invisible force had yanked her back into the present. She opened her mouth, wanting to say his name, but her throat closed up. Her breath hitched. Her eyes followed his back as he walked away, calm, quiet, strong to the point of breaking her heart. The man who had once been underestimated and labeled a burden was now the only one leaving this room with his head held high. Images flashed through Olivia's mind. The garage lights, the smell of engine oil, simple dinners, cold windy nights when they still laughed together. She had not just lost money, she had lost something far greater, something no settlement could replace, the man she had pushed out of her life with her own hands. Outside, the winter wind roared down the courthouse hallway. Mark paused on the steps for a few seconds, breathing deeply, letting the cold air wash through him like a final cleansing. He carried no sense of victory, only the feeling of setting down the weight of many years, the pain, the humiliation, and the unanswered expectations. Daniel walked out a little later. His face had gone gray, his steps were heavy. When their eyes met, there was no challenge, no mockery, only a quiet acknowledgement that Mark had moved beyond his reach long ago, and he had simply refused to see it. "What will you do next?" Daniel blurted out, as if talking to himself more than to Mark. Mark let his gaze drift into the distance, toward the rising skeleton of the infrastructure project, where steel frames reached up like a new spine for the city. "Keep building," he said softly. One sentence carrying an entire journey. Daniel bowed his head. For the first time, he understood that power did not lie in pulling others down. It lay in the ability to stand up from pain and keep walking calmly forward, even when you had been judged and dismissed to the very bottom. Olivia stopped at the doorway, her hand resting on the cold wooden frame. She watched Mark's figure as it grew smaller in the distance. Her tears fell, not loud, not dramatic, just a silent stream. She did not beg any more. She no longer had the right to. In the courthouse yard, the first snow of the season fell in a thin layer, like white dust over the stone steps. Mark walked across it, leaving clear footprints behind. Each step firm, each step steady. With every step, the distance between the man he used to be and the man he had become grew wider. The wind swept across the open square, making the metal flags clink faintly in the distance. The air was cold, but inside Mark, a quiet warmth was spreading, the warmth of being free from the past, no longer bound by the shame of being looked down on, no longer controlled by betrayal. He walked on without turning back. Ahead of him was a new road, long, open, and resolute, a road for those who have the courage to step out of the shadows to find themselves. The first dawn after the trial opened with a scene that seemed almost unreal. Olivia stood before the massive gates of the new infrastructure site, where blocks of concrete rose through the morning mist like the new backbone of the city. She no longer wore silk dresses or high heels. There was only a thin coat, hair tousled by the wind, and eyes steeped in a sadness that no longer screamed, only smoldered, deep and true. Mark appeared among the engineers and workers. The golden safety helmet on his head caught the first light of day. His gaze was calm, his voice firm, each instruction clear and decisive. The grease-stained mechanic she had once left behind was gone. In front of her stood a man who remained solid in the center of the storm, who did not need to flaunt power, because power radiated from his absolute composure. She stepped closer. Her heart raced, as if one stronger breath might shatter the last bit of courage she had left. "Mark!" Her voice was hoarse, breaking slightly at the end. He stopped. In that moment, the wind seemed to fall silent. No one spoke. No one stepped into the fragile line between two people who had walked through love, brokenness, betrayal, and now met again at the crossroads of loss and growth. "I did not come to take anything back," Olivia said, her eyes lowered to the concrete still dusted with white. "I just wanted to say, there are things we only understand when it is too late." She drew a breath. "I chose to leave because I was afraid of walking through the hard days with you, and in the end, I lost the only thing that truly mattered." A heavy stillness passed between them. There was no anger left in Mark's eyes, no lingering wound from the night they split, only the peace of someone who had walked to the very end of pain, then let it go. "We are the past," he said quietly. The words were light as breath, yet when they fell, they weighed like stone. Olivia nodded faintly. For the first time, she did not plead, did not defend herself. She simply faced the truth as it was. A young engineer ran up to report on the schedule. Mark turned away and returned to his work. But before he walked off completely, he paused. His voice dropped, as if leaving a final farewell. "If there's anything worth keeping," he said, "let it be the lesson, not for self-punishment, but so it will not be repeated." Olivia smiled faintly through her tears. No more desperation, no more clinging, only a pain that had finally accepted its shape. That afternoon, the city lit up. The project moved into a new phase. The media called Mark a symbol of willpower. The man who was once underestimated had become the pillar of a development that would transform an entire region. But inside him, there were no fireworks, no cheers, only the steady quiet of a journey that was still far from its end. He stood on the balcony of the operations building, looking down at the lines of streetlights weaving together like the lifeblood of the city. In the night wind, he understood that the greatest victory of his life was not money, not fame, not the fall of anyone else. It was that he had remained himself, even when he was looked down on, betrayed, and left behind. In the distance, Olivia walked into the night, no longer carrying the ambition to climb higher, no longer chasing distant lights. She carried something heavier, but more real, an understanding of the value of loyalty, of the kindness she had lost, and of the man she had only truly recognized when she no longer had the right to stand beside him. The night closed in, but this story did not end in pain. It ended in maturity, in the way each person walked toward their own road, with a lesson carved deep into their hearts. If you are somewhere between the choices of your life, between fear and trust, between loss and courage, share how this story makes you feel. Whose side are you on? What did you take from this journey? Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and if this story resonates with you, do not forget to subscribe and follow the channel so we can continue to walk together through more profound stories of real life.